Ladies and gentlemen, this is your Election Day podcast, your Election Day coverage of the PB podcast, Pushing Boundaries. I'm Silas Knowles, the ZB Pirate. This is Pushing Boundaries. Got some new graphics to show you. Very, very, very upbeat, very, very sparkly, if you will. So definitely, we wish everyone well on this Election Day. Hopefully you went out and voted. Hopefully you went out and did your thing. You know, we'll leave it at that at the commentary. So, you know, we'll leave it from there. My guest today definitely is someone we wanted to talk to. Her name is Dana Goodier, 20 years of experience in education. She has taught everything from world languages and English, worked as a middle school administrator, completed her doctorate degree in educational leadership in early 2020. So just finished off this year. For her dissertation, she researched reasons parents were opting their students out of high-stake testing at middle schools and how that affected the district accreditation rating. She also speaks at conferences, providing educators with techniques to minimize off-task behavior, increasing time on their current tasks. She is the host of her Out of the Trenches podcast, which is something that our good friend, Dr. Rick Jett, or Dr. J, has been a part of. Definitely, I invite you to go check her out. It's a very interesting podcast with a wide range of guests. She features educators who share their stories of resiliency, in and out of the classroom, in and out of public speaking, authors, publishers, all sorts of stuff. If you need to want to follow her on social media, it's at Dana Goodier on Twitter, and then www.danagoodier.com. I do appreciate her. I do appreciate everything she does. Dana, how are you doing?
Great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, definitely. This is our new thing and everything else. And this is my dirty little habit. I decided to take this on when we did Recovery Mode. I'm sure you've seen it and heard of it, the Recovery Mode book that was published over the summer. And we went with contributors, and then we went past the contributors, just inviting educators and administrators on, talking about everything education, this whole COVID thing, pushing boundaries in and out of the classroom. So we appreciate you definitely. And I saw your episode with Rick. I have to say, bravo, you made him look good. It's very hard to make him look good. Sorry, brother. Sorry. But it's very hard to make the boss man look good, but he always looks good, anything he does. But Dana, whereabouts are you right now? Like, where are you in the world? Like in the United States?
I live outside of Denver in Lone Tree, Colorado.
Excellent. Have you always been out there?
I've lived everywhere. I've lived in Colorado for about 17 years, but I spent a lot of my young adult life in Norway, actually.
Oh, very interesting.
And then after my bachelor's, I went back to the U.S., completed my master's in the calendar year of 1999, and then went to Canada in Quebec for a couple of years to pursue a doctorate back in the early 2000s. Didn't complete that doctorate, so I still had that urge to get a doctorate. It was a totally different subject area when I did do my doctorate this past 16 through 20. Mm-hmm. But so I've lived internationally. I speak several languages fluently, so I have that perspective of a lot of travel, a lot of work with tourists when I lived in Norway, those type of things.
So do I dare ask, how many languages do you speak?
I speak 4 fluently, including English, so French, Norwegian, German, and I also speak a little bit of Spanish.
I think, in today's age, I think we all need to speak a little bit of Spanish. Uh-huh. Even people look at me, they're like, your last name is Knowles? I'm like, yes, it's Knowles. I can speak Spanish. I have a little darker skin tone. So yeah, Spanish is in my background. My mother's from Guatemala. My dad met her in the Peace Corps way back when. And I always say that my dad had a brown heart, and everything else. Spoke Spanish better than my mother at times, even though if my mother heard me say that right now, she'd probably strike me down, but what are you going to do? Mm-hmm. So how is it when it comes to Denver? I mean, you basically are doing consulting work, you're doing speaking and everything else. How are you seeing COVID, impact your area around in Denver?
Well, I would say it's definitely a hodgepodge in this area. I'm in a district that has hybrid. For right now, it's secondary. So 7 or 6 through 12 are the AB model. Okay. So they're going to school 2 days a week, and everybody is remote on Fridays for secondary. And after fall break, they brought back elementary full-time in person. That can change depending on the testing positivity rate. But there are districts, so there are a few districts, smaller districts in the Denver area who have gone back K-12 in person, but they're very small, like 5,000 students. I'm in a district with 65,000 students. There's also like Denver Public, the largest Colorado district. They did start bringing back elementary, but then they sent them back home basically when the numbers went up. So now they're just like K-2 in person or hybrid, and then everybody else is remote. So it's really a hodgepodge across the Denver area. And I think Colorado Springs is mostly hybrid. And then some elementary schools there are full-time in person because, the transmission rate is lower for the younger kids. And as a parent of 3 kids, which of one is in middle school, but it helps to have those options, right? And they surveyed us a lot, both staff and parents in the summer, and there were like 84% of parents wanted the kids to go back in person. So luckily in this area, we've kept our rates down, and just kind of worrying about that winter, and it's worked pretty well. I think the model, of course, there's not enough content getting covered. I think a lot of teachers are frustrated about that. There's several schools that are on the IB model. So some of those kids that are in the AP or the IB program are worried about those tests that they have at the end of the year, getting enough content. There are groups that have to quarantine, on a regular basis.
Right.
But they have a good model with having, if the teacher has to quarantine and there's some kids in the classroom in person, the teacher's just teaching from the computer on Google Meet. So it's worked.
I have to say this new way of teaching right now has provided us, the teachers, with flexibility. Yeah. Like I can roll out of bed and be like, do I want to go in? I don't have to. I can go to my office and just broadcast from here. I'm just, it's one of those things where you have that. I think that flexibility is good, but I'm in Chicago, and at this point, I don't know if we're ever going back, because I just hit like 6,500 today or 6,000, and we've been at 7,500. I don't know what's going on. All I know is I have 4 girls, and I just tell them, wear your masks, make sure you sanitize, wash your hands, and we're all good. Yeah. So we hope, and we have an interactive learning remote model where we do 2 days that we're required to be in the building in person for office hours. So students can actually come into the building. We have internet cafes set up. We have social distancing set up and everything. So trying to get that more comfortable with the students. But overall, I think, again, I've seen my girls in their district, they're full remote, and it's just a hodgepodge everywhere you go. I think it gets to the point where it's getting interesting. But go into your dissertation and go into the stuff that you worked on. So to transition there, to make sure everyone knows what we're talking about, because I think I do, but I want to just flush it out a little bit to talk about it. But for the people who don't know, when we talk about in your bio, high stakes testing, what are you referring to when you talk about high stakes testing and parents worried about that or anything else? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Well, so something I've been a part of ever since I started working K-12 education is that the testing, the state standardized testing is what I'm referring to. And I wrote a chapter in Rick's book that talks a lot the book that's coming out as well. So implications of high stakes testing and what we're doing. And so kind of my experience as an educator in Colorado, we've changed the name of that test, ever since the No Child Left Behind era. But it's always kind of the same. Sometimes it's tested science, and sometimes it hasn't tested science at certain grade levels. Sometimes they've only had like the odd grades, right? And sometimes they've tested all the grades. But everybody throughout the U.S. can agree, even internationally, that we're putting so much more emphasis on high stakes testing now more than ever. And I think after things go back to semi-normal, at least, I think that'll change. So I finished, I got my dissertation approved right before everything shut down. So my study was based on the high stakes testing that took place between 2014 and 2019 in this suburban district in Colorado. And I looked at 3 middle schools and how many parents were opting out their kids at these middle schools because there's a lot of parental involvement. I wanted to look at the whole district and their accreditation rating, which was accredited with low participation, but looking at the whole district was going to be too big a challenge for one researcher. So I narrowed it down to 3 middle schools and kind of looked at how that changed, particularly at one middle school, that the principal and the admin team were able to just provide information to families about how the teachers used the data from testing to inform their lessons, also to inform, students that might need extra support. So having kids participate in the testing was a positive thing because there was a lot of negativity around testing prior to 2014, 15, 16, and even 17. And one particular middle school was like the lowest rated in participation, I think in 2017, and then they went up to the highest in the district in participation the next year. And what we can't do in Colorado, which I assume would be the same in many states, is you can neither persuade nor discourage families and students from taking the test. You can just say, hey, we have our schedule. It's in March, usually sometimes in April, and it's these days we're going to have classes, shorter classes in the afternoon, but we have testing in the morning, and we'll provide breakfast, and we'll have breaks. But, a lot of parents will just say, I'm not bringing my kid that day, right?
Right.
So what I found was interesting is just kind of how those schools gave information to their families that then the families in turn could decide whether or not they wanted their child to participate in testing. And it also affects the neighborhood, like the pricing of houses, right? Because a lot of time when you're shopping for real estate, you look at how schools are rated, which, really, I don't think schools should be rated on how kids perform on standardized tests, but unfortunately, that's still how they're looked at. So, that's one key factor that goes into buying houses in that area where the school's located. And I also had experienced working in other districts that, there are places where they do encourage participation, right? They have prizes, the pizza parties, the ice cream parties, the bike giveaway, shortly after the testing period is over.
Wow.
So not the district that I participated in for the research, but, that does happen. So I think everybody is kind of deciding on how they can bring those students in. And, I know that there is a testing window for 2021 in Colorado. We'll see if it actually happens. Schools are planning their testing calendar, and depending on how many students are in person or remote, I'm sure Pearson's going to have to figure out a way to give those students that testing through the remote model. But I think they will want some data this spring because they didn't get any data in the spring of 2020. So, but I think in general, I'd like us to stop putting so much emphasis on how kids perform. It's such a snapshot, right? It's that day that they take that one test, or they might take a period of various math tests over a period of 3 days. But it's that snapshot, that one day in March in the spring, and they might be having a hard week. So it shouldn't, like, as a parent, when I receive the scores from my kids, I don't really take those to heart, because that's how my son performed that day, or he might have given up on some of the questions. And I've also been on a item analysis committee where we look at items that they make for the testing. And as teachers, we're looking at how valid those items should be, and should they be thrown out. They're like trial items that they've put on the test that don't count. So it's interesting to see, as a team of teachers, should this item even be on there? Because as a teacher, can you really even understand how are they expecting the students to understand what to do on that item?
We had conferences with one of my children last night on the computer through Google Meet, and she shared map testing with my 10-year-old through the screen, and she even stated, it's like, look, here's the map scores. I wouldn't put any emphasis on it because it was one day. And just exactly what you said. And I'm thinking to myself too, I'm just like, okay, but do you think, what's the solution? Do you think there's going to be a solution somewhere down the line where they don't really rely highly on this data and they go to another way of trying to measure students' aptitude without doing these type of tests?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I hope after this kind of transition year where we're in these different models, I hope that we do focus more on social emotional learning, right? Focus on student skills such as empathy and kindness and what they're doing in like tying that into our curriculum, whether we're teaching foreign language or English or science, and maybe having informal assessments, maybe that the school is, I would say, using some type of project-based learning to have students show their knowledge of that content, but show it through that critical lens, not only with SEL, but even with social justice, right? And I think, we've seen a lot happen since the pandemic started in just how students are amplifying their voices. And also we understand that the rate of student depression and student trauma is really on the rise. So I think we really need to take that into account. We do want to still have data. As I said, in the spring of 2021, it's probably going to look similar to what it has looked, but I think those at the state level and those at the district levels and people that are in charge of making any type of assessments really need to take into account another way of gathering data, because we don't want to just look at that snapshot, and we want to to have something that also reflects student voice, right? Because it's these powers that be that are deciding on how schools should be rated, and a lot of the time the principal and people at the district don't have a say in what the testing companies are putting on the test, right? And the testing company people are not in the schools.
Definitely. It just, I think, going forward, I mean, you were talking about how schools sometimes advertise that data with real estate and things. Mm-hmm. And there's a specific school. Oh, hold on. I have to, Mr. Kubiak gave you some props. Hey, Jeff, we love you, brother. Hey, and just, what, quick, cheap plug. Jeff's got a new book coming out. Definitely go see it. Search him out on Amazon, jeffkubiak.com. He's awesome, definitely. And Jeff, I hope you're doing well out there in California. Hopefully everything is subsided a little bit. We love you, brother. Anyway, there's a big time school. It's like two schools. It's one of the most epic schools I've ever seen, Stevenson High School. And they do market for their school, say, hey, you could live by Stevenson High School. And they're the number one basketball team in the state. They have the number one computer robotics team in the state and the math team in the state. And on top of that, their MAP scores and SAT scores and everything are just through the roof and everything else. And it's just like, great, but that's one day. That's one day that these kids took this test. It doesn't show the social and emotional. It doesn't show over time. It doesn't show that extra, we have 180 days. You took one day out of that 180 days. And, and they did well that day, or some students might not have. And, I'm just going with your research and what you've been talking about. I don't think it's a fair representation of what students should be doing, students should do all the time. So it's something that definitely has to be looked at. Transitioning off of that a little bit, some of your work does reflect off-task behavior. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the best way, especially, pre-COVID and post-COVID, to derail off-task behavior in the classroom?
Well, number one key is relationships, right? If we're in a classroom setting in person, I've often have talked to people at conferences when I've had breakout sessions about those low-level misbehaviors where students are tapping pencils on a desk or crumpling the water bottle, right?
Oh, I love that. I love that.
Or even the fidget spinners we had about 3 years ago, they didn't last too long, right? But those things that we can ignore for a certain period of time, but then, once we give the kid what you call a shutdown request and you just ask them, please stop crumpling the water bottle. If they don't do that, you wait 30 seconds, then you go on and you ask, you can go on to the next step of what you would, how you would handle that situation with the student. So, a lot of it's built on how, you set your classroom expectations and getting kids to be on the same page. As a class, I like to do what you would call a class code of conduct. I've worked in schools that have capturing kids' hearts. They call it more of a class contract, right? And then you're putting that out for that class period. Now, in the remote model, if you haven't been able to meet your kids in person yet, you still, are developing the relationships online. And I've done some teaching in the summer online of smaller groups, but it depends. It is hard, I admit, when a kid isn't showing themselves on the camera, right? And I think a lot of the time that is like, if their peers aren't turning their cameras on, then they're not going to, right? Because you might have a kid in a class, in a peer that, they know isn't there, they might turn their camera on. So there's various reasons for that. And it could also be about their home situation and all that. So I think, whether or not you can actually see them on the camera isn't as important as what you're actually discussing with them, right? And just knowing tools, like you were saying before we started recording, to have those prompting questions, to be able to acknowledge, tomorrow coming in after Election Day, some of the fears that kids might have and concerns that they might have, even in this remote learning model with our students. So, time on task, it is very fluid right now because everybody's doing their own thing. Like my son who's using Google Classroom on his days that he's not in person, right? And, it could take a kid 5 hours to complete their 7 classes of work, and it could take another kid 2.5 hours. And you can't really measure that as time on task. And I think, schools are measuring those non-in-person days as instructional days because that's the model that they have. But, how much is a student actually participating in school, right? Because you can have a live meeting with your students, but, if a student is sitting there with their camera off, they might be on their phone playing Fortnite. So, and that's difficult for the teacher to know.
It's Among Us. You have to get it right. It's Among Us right now. That's the game.
Yeah. So measuring time on task, I think, is not easy when you're actually, teaching through the screen. And if you have a good relationship though with the student, if you know the parents and you're able to reach out to them as well, you can't expect, especially at the middle school and high school level, the parents are going to be breathing over the student's shoulder. And I've experienced that myself, like asking my son, I'm taking your phone. If I see you in a live class, right, and you're on your phone, no way. But that's
nowadays. I mean, we can do it all day long, but just to make sure everyone's doing it, there's so many phone calls, there's so many emails, there's so many text messages going out. So out of the trenches, how did that come to fruition? How did that come out of the trenches, so to speak, and become reality for you in your podcast?
Well, I just, I thought about having a podcast probably since early in the 1920 school year. And I've been working with Danny Bauer of Better Leaders, Better Schools for a while, and I'm in his mastermind. So, I thought a little bit about, hosting my own podcast. I just didn't want to take the plunge. And I thought, I'd have to invest in a lot of gear and really don't have to, spend a whole lot of money in equipment. And after it was close to the end of the school year, decided I might as well just take the plunge. And I think the name came about from just, a lot of time we say, and some of the guests that I've interviewed, my question I ask everybody is, tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out. And a lot of people will talk about something in the past, but there are people who say, I'm currently in the trenches, and how they're working through their particular model with COVID. But also some people are saying, I'm in the trenches as an educator, but that's not a negative thing. So it depends on how people interpret that. My theme of the podcast is having these educators share stories of resilience, what they learned from that experience, how it made them a better educator. I've interviewed several authors, like Rick, for example, and how, that story that they wrote about in the book, has helped others and, help them, in their further in their career. So, I think we're all learning as we go. And I would definitely consider myself a lifelong learner. Not only the fact that I went back after giving up on a doctorate program in the early 2000s and completing a doctorate in educational leadership recently, but also just the fact that I'm like a PD junkie. I'm doing a breakout session this weekend for Colorado Association of Middle Level Educators, and my sessions on like choosing what type of PD is best for you and your team. But I've always, wanted to learn from people and their stories. And I think it's the podcast's given me a great platform to do that. People from newer teachers through retired administrators and college professors. So kind of across the board.
Yeah, definitely. There's always been something to learn. And I've been doing this since, beginning of the summer. And it's just every time I do one, I always learn so much more and so much more. And I'm getting so much information, and I'm just like, it's a privilege to do it, because I look forward to doing it, because it's more of a labor of love than anything else, because I'm gaining so much as an educator, and I'm gaining so much, not even being in the classroom. And I think that's what people who don't really do education podcasts, like, listen to them. They should. Because there's so much that I've learned from just listening to other people and just sitting and being that listener and just taking in everything and just and gaining so much from other people's experiences and other people's work and other people's things that they do. So that's awesome. I mean, I've heard a couple. I've listened to a couple of yours Out of the Trenches podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed them, especially Rick's, and I did notice Jeff's as well. So I mean, I know your guest list and my guest list has a couple similarities. So definitely, they bring that real good fire and everything else, and you bring those stories out of them. So that's really awesome to see. So going forward, and you talked about your question that you ask all your podcast guests. I have one too, as my theme. So how do you think we as educators, administrators, anyone in education, how do we push the boundaries of our classrooms, virtually or in person, to get through this COVID, to get through this, to reach every student? How do you think we can push boundaries to make sure every student is reached, every student is engaged to the best of our ability? What do you think?
Well, I think it takes a lot of outside the box thinking. And we saw a lot of educators do that in the spring, reaching out to their community, seeing who needed technology, who needed internet access, but also figuring out what works for your building, right? Whether you are an admin assistant, whether you're in the cafeteria, whether you're a para, the principal, the custodian, taking the whole building and really find out the pulse of the building, right? But both of the students, whether the students need social, emotionally, but also what does the staff need? I think pushing the boundaries a lot as we go forward in education is making sure that the staff are well cared for as well, because that's something we're seeing at these rates of teacher burnout as never before, right? And teachers are asked to answer emails around the clock, or maybe not asked to, but they feel like they're expected to, right? Because there are parents who have questions throughout the 24-hour day, right? Or students that are doing their work in the middle of the night. So I think as leaders, both at the building and district leaders, really need to look at what they can do to just make things easier, I guess, for educators in the buildings, how they can provide, maybe more support, because you don't want to go in as a principal to a classroom and say, how are you doing? Because the teacher will say, I'm doing fine. You want to say, what can I do to support you? Right. So recognizing that people are going to need support, even if they have, they did some type of a flip model before the pandemic and they were pretty well versed in technology. There might be some parent issues that they have support with, right? They might be just personal issues. And I think just building those relationships as a building leader or a department leader helps a lot. So I think, those boundaries really need to be pushed in wanting to make education a field that more people want to go into in the future as well, because we aren't seeing so many people that want to become teachers anymore. So, having this become a more appreciated profession and placing value on our educators.
Yeah, I think even now more than ever, I mean, we see teachers leaving because of this whole model that we're going through, but more and more you see teachers rising to the level of what their expectations, and even going past it, to be able to service their kids. And it's really cool to see all these teachers coming together and working as buildings. I know my building, we're all coming together. The collaboration is through the roof, and it's ridiculous on a level beyond other. Now, Dana, I see your social media at Dana Goodier on Twitter. Is there any other social media or anything that people should be following you at?
So the podcast has a handle. It's just Out of Trenches PC on Twitter and also on Instagram. And then I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook. You can connect with me there. You mentioned my website at the beginning of the show.
Excellent. So definitely, Dana, we do appreciate you. I always like to keep it around 30 minutes to be mindful of everyone's time. I do appreciate your time today, and definitely, keep doing what you're doing, man. Just keep helping those educators, keep, pushing the boundaries like you are, and really going above and beyond for everybody. So we do appreciate you and appreciate everything you do.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
Oh, definitely. Everybody else, guys, happy Election Day. I hope everyone got a chance to vote. This is Pushing Boundaries, the PB podcast. What are you guys doing to push the boundaries of your classroom virtually or in school? And what are you doing what are you doing at home to push the boundaries for your kids at home as well? And just remember, we're here for our students all the time. Guys, I'm Silas Knowles. This is Dana Goodier. We'll talk to you soon. We'll see you soon for some more content later in the week. Everyone have a great day and enjoy your week. Dana, thank you so much.
Bye-bye.